History 122, American Foreign Policy, or really the Cold War, 1945 to 1980. This is a supplement to the weekly reading of the Cold War and American Yop and the 1960s American Yop. Also in Canvas, you can find a template called History 122 Foreign Policy Notes, in which you can type up information from this PowerPoint into a nice orderly form that you can study from. So this is just merely a supplement. So, understanding the Cold War. World War II is over, and the two remaining superpowers happen to be the Soviet Union and the United States. The Soviet Union has the largest army in the world and occupy Eastern and Central Europe. It is communism, as we all know. It is a police state, one party rule, lack of freedoms that the people in the United States enjoy. While the United States, its former ally in World War II, is obviously democracy. We say multi party democracy, but let's be honest, it's a two party democracy with a third party here or there. It's free market capitalism. And so, really, what the Cold War is going to be is a war of words rather than actual outright conflict, in which we say in the Cold War, a state of hostility between nations without actual fighting. Now, there will be flashpoints in the world in which the United States may back one side against the Soviet Union, like in Afghanistan, or the Soviet Union may back one side, like, for instance, against the United States, like in Korea, Cuba, and Vietnam. But there won't really be direct fighting between the two. Soviet Union wants to expand communism throughout the world. The United States wants to contain it, and hopefully in the long run, communism will die out. And so, like I said, there are hot spots from 1945 up through the 1980s, which the United States and the Soviet Union are going to back different sides, get active into conflicts. And of course, behind all of this idea is, will there be a nuclear war? The United States is the main superpower because we have nuclear weapons. But by 1949, that'll change when the Soviets get nuclear weapons. So this is what really I grew up in the 1980s outside D.C. was, all right, time to do a little duck and cover drill if they nuke D.C. Now, one difference between the end of World War I versus the end of World War II is now the United States is going to take an active role in the world. Remember, after World War I, we rejected the Treaty of Versailles, rejected the League of Nations because it was a defensive alliance. We withdrew amongst ourselves. And although we did try to augment our neutrality laws in the 1930s, it was too late as all hell broke loose throughout the world. Well, now, after World War II, the United States is going to be the leaders of the free world. One way to do this is with the creation of the United Nations. It was created in San Francisco in August of 1945. Eventually, it would move to New York City. And the United Nations has more teeth than the League of Nations. The United Nations is made up with a General Assembly among member nations. And of course, it's pretty much the same idea as the League of Nations. A Congress of Nations will get together to discuss world problems, whether it is one country invading another country, whether it is internal problems within a nation, whether it is, like, for instance, in the 80s, famines throughout parts of Africa and parts throughout the world. The United Nations is going to deal with these issues. If there is aggressive warlike movements among nations, those things get pushed up to what we call the Security Council. And the Security Council is a 15-member body authorized for peacekeeping and to promote international security. Peacekeeping means you can send in UN forces to keep the peace between warring factions. Or if you have to, you can send in troops like the United States and the UN would do in Korea. Now, if you notice, there are 5 permanent members on the Security Council. And you notice today these are major nations. Now you're looking at it going, well, why did we pick those 5 nations? Well, those happen to be the 5 major allied powers after World War II. United States, Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, and China. Although from 1949 to the mid-1970s, China was represented by Taiwan. Because when China went red or communism in 1949, the United States, France, and Britain still recognized the nationalists who had escaped to Taiwan as the rightful government of China, which would cause conflict for many, many, many decades. There's 10 other nations that are on the Security Council, and they rotate every 2 years, and resolutions must be unanimous. And so the United Nations is active throughout the world. Now, one obvious issue is, what do you do with Japan after World War II? We dropped 2 nuclear weapons on Japan, August 6th and August 9th. Well, some people argue we did that because even by August of 1945, we already knew that the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin was not going to give back any territory they occupied in Eastern Europe. So we wanted to not only end the war quickly in Japan before the Soviet Union could invade northern Japan like they promised to do, and we also kind of wanted to intimidate the Soviets a bit. So the first thing we did is we entered into a reform program. Emperor Hirohito, the gentleman on the right, he has a ceremonial role. He is going to do everything we tell him to do. That was one of the conditions we had with Japan on their surrender. We always said it was an unconditional surrender of Japan, but we did promise not to hold the emperor up to war crimes as long as he supports reform and becomes a figurehead. And because of this, really from 1945 to really 1950, the gentleman on the left, General Douglas MacArthur, he pretty much controlled Japan. We democratized Japan. We gave them a new constitution similar to ours. We demilitarized Japan. Japan could only really have an internal police force. They were not allowed to have any offensive military weapons. The United States would do that for them. And so because of that, because Japan did not have to spend a lot of expenditures in the military, they would become a dominant economic force. We also wanted a quick economic recovery because we realized, as things were kind of happening in Europe, that these destroyed nations, those people were susceptible to communism. Remember, communism says food, shelter, a job. And when countries are destroyed, that actually resonates with people. They go, oh, okay, well, what are the capitalist countries doing? Well, nothing yet. Here come the communists saying, we'll help you rebuild. And so we quickly rebuilt Japan. That's why they were a strong economic powerhouse, but also a strong ally of the United States. Japan has been a strong ally. We've had an alliance. And the first time in Japanese history since the end of World War II that Japan actually sent troops overseas was during the Iraqi War. They symbolically sent 500 soldiers to support us in the Iraqi War. So Japan, things will settle there. Now, what really we're going to have our focus on is Europe, because there were conferences towards the end of World War II that was supposed to decide what was the makeup of Europe going to be. And so we created something called, or as Winston Churchill called, an Iron Curtain. Iron Curtain, if you look at that map on the lower right between the red and the red is communism, the blue is capitalism, or the blue would be the states that support the United States, red is the states or countries that support the Soviet Union. Don't worry about like that little grayish and like little light, I don't know what to call it. That's Yugoslavia. They're kind of like what they call non-aligned. They don't favor either side. So the one thing we did do is we created a weakened Germany. We occupied Germany in 4 zones. In the upper right, the one in red is the Democratic Republic of Germany, East Germany. That is occupied by the Soviet Union. And then England, France, and the United States would occupy the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany. The 3 western portions of Germany would reunite to form West Germany. Well, although early on the Soviets said, okay, well, we'll give you back East Germany, the Soviets never did. East Germany would be a puppet of the Soviet Union up through 1989. And so that's why when I grew up, it was always had a lot of friends whose parents worked at the Pentagon. Almost all of them went through Germany because that was a flashpoint. Germany and Korea. When I grew up, my friends' parents worked at the Pentagon. I go, where you been? Oh, we spent 18 months in Berlin because that was a flashpoint. Oh, we spent some time at near the 38th parallel because that was a flashpoint in Korea. Now, like I said, Eastern Europe, Soviet Union did not withdraw. It promised to hold free elections in Eastern Europe, which they held elections, but it was only communist members who were allowed to run. And the Soviet Union did not withdraw from Eastern Europe. They created what we call satellite nations. A satellite, as we all know, the moon rotates around the earth. Well, these satellite nations get their information and what they're told to do from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union occupied Eastern Europe and East Germany because they said, If there's going to be another war, let the war take place in Central Europe or Eastern Europe. We want a buffer zone from another invasion. It happened in World War I, it happened in World War II, not again. And the Soviet Union wants to expand. They're going to send in supplies to help the communists in Turkey and Greece. They're going to send in supplies at the best they can to West Germany and France and other destroyed nations. So they forced communist regimes in Eastern Europe, and those regimes would stay around all the way up through 1991. Now, our president, Harry Truman, the gentleman who had replaced Franklin Roosevelt, and Roosevelt died in April of 1945, he creates the policy of containment. Now, there was a American diplomat who had spent time in Moscow during the war, and when he came back to the United States, he's going to tell the United States, look, the Soviet Union's going to say a lot of crazy things. That is to keep their people in line because people lack a lot of things in the Soviet Union. So the government has to create an enemy. You see that in North Korea today, and the great enemy would be the United States. But this gentleman is going to argue that the Soviet leadership actually quite insane. They don't want to go into a nuclear war. And if you contain communism wherever the Soviets try to expand, the Soviet Union will, for the most part, back down. They're not going to start a nuclear war. So knowing this, Harry Truman is going to create something called the Truman Doctrine. And according to the Truman Doctrine, which was actually just a line or two in a speech that Harry Truman gave after the war, and he simply says in this speech that the United States will provide economic and military support for any nation that is threatened by communism. We're going to go in there and we're going to help you out. We want to contain communism because the belief is if communism is allowed to spread, it won't be stopped. And the next thing you know, it's going to be knocking on the door of the United States. And so, starting in 1947, two nations that were ravaged by World War II, you don't hear much about, is Greece and Turkey. And it was an internal civil war in those countries. And the communist Soviets were backing a lot of communist movements in those countries. The United States funneled in hundreds of millions of dollars to rebuild Greece, to rebuild Turkey. And that was successful. That is going to be our foreign policy all the way up to the 1980s, contain it. Now, we also set up really our Department of Defense and our foreign policy apparatus with the National Security Act of 1947. We created the Department of Defense to deal with all our growing military apparatus. We also, under the National Security Act, created a National Security Council, which is an advisory council to the president to discuss issues in foreign policy and security, not also within the United States, but also outside the United States. Where are hot spots? Where are the Soviets trying to go next? Where are communist regimes getting popular? We also created the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, to go out and really, and sometimes undercover, I hate to say it, develop revolutions to stop communism from spreading. And you can see how our expenditures during the Cold War for the Department of Defense are high, even when there's not wars, because we're spending a lot of money to contain communism. So you see World War II, it drops. The Korea, Vietnam, and the Reagan era, we really pump up our Department of Defense expenditures. But even on down years, we still spend hundreds of billions of dollars to contain communism. Now, the Truman Doctrine was successful. Greece and Turkey were slowly recovering. The internal civil war between those backed by the United States and the communists backed by the Soviet Union and those two nations was going away. So our mindset was, why not expand that? And so our Secretary of State, George Marshall, is going to create the Marshall Plan. If money was successful in rebuilding Greece and Turkey, well, let's offer it to all European nations. And yes, that includes Eastern Europe. $13 billion in grants to rebuild European countries. And you notice a lot of money in France, United Kingdom, West Germany, Netherlands, Italy, Austria. And although we offered it, obviously, to the eastern half of Europe, it was declined. And my father worked for the United States government, and even in the 1990s, he said, You could drive through Western Europe, it's all modern, and it goes, you did not need a road sign to tell you were in the eastern half of Germany or in Eastern Europe, because it was like going back 50 years. The Soviets really didn't spend a lot of money rebuilding Eastern Europe. Frankly, after World War II, the Soviets went in there and took any factory that was still standing and brought it back to the Soviet Union. And so that'll be a catalyst for the Eastern Europeans eventually rebelling in the 1980s. But the Marshall Plan, going back to that, was designed to prevent communist uprisings or infiltration in vulnerable nations, and eventually it would be successful. The Truman Doctrine Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe. We will try that in Asia, but it won't work. It's just interesting that what worked in Europe doesn't work in what we call more underdeveloped nations in Asia. Now, because the United States is winning with the Truman Doctrine, with the Marshall Plan, Joseph Stalin wants to win someplace. So in 1949, he is going to cut off West Berlin. Berlin lies deep in East Germany. Remember, East Germany is under the Soviet Union control, but Berlin itself had been split into East and West Berlin. The western half was under the control of the Allied powers such as England, France, and the United States, while the East Berlin was Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin wanted to have a small little victory and put a little dent into the policy of containment. He will cut off all road traffic and rail traffic to Berlin starting in 1948, and he is hoping that the United States particularly will just let West Berlin fall, that the United States will not be willing to actually defend West Berlin. What's interesting, going back to the policy of containment, the gentleman who developed it said, look, you don't have to worry about it. The Soviets will do some crazy stuff, but leadership itself will not start a war. And so using that idea, we decided to create an airlift. And we launched from 3 major airfields in West Germany an aerial campaign to keep West Berlin fed and fueled. And for over a year, every couple minutes, a plane would land in West Berlin. We dropped food, fuel to the citizens. By 1949, the stores in West Berlin were packed. You also had toys, non-essential goods in West Berlin. And so obviously Joseph Stalin had lost this, and eventually he was going to blink. It's extremely successful. We knew the Soviets were not going to start shooting down planes to start a war over this. 200,000 flights, 47,000 tons of supplies daily. At the beginning of the airlift, it was basically just to keep the West Berliners alive. Then it got more and more and more and more. What's interesting is that kids used to hang outside the airfields in West Berlin because the pilots used to drop pieces of chocolate on parachutes. And when Stalin's watching all this, he's like, okay, I've lost. So in Europe, the containment policy was very successful. Now, in order to protect weaker nations, the United States would back the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Remember, the League of Nations was a defensive alliance after World War I, and the United States says, we want nothing to do with it. After World War II, we're going to take the lead. In the late 1940s, we're going to create NATO, and it's still around today. NATO is a defensive alliance, a permanent alliance between the United States, Canada, and Western Europe. If you look at a map today, more and more countries in Europe join NATO because not only is it a defensive alliance, but it really has become an economic bond. So Eastern European countries want to join NATO. The one big issue today with Russia happened to be that Ukraine wants to join NATO. And Russia sees Ukraine under their sphere of influence. The United States and other countries are like, yeah, let Ukraine in because it's more of an economic bond. If one member is attacked, all treaty nations will have to defend. And that is to help out some of the weaker nations in Europe that may not be able to push back a Soviet excursion. In response, the Soviet Union will create the Warsaw Pact. Warsaw is the major city in Poland. Now, let's be honest, it should be called the Moscow Pact, but they call it the Warsaw Pact, so it makes it look like the Soviets are just part of it, and the other member nations in Eastern Europe are not taking orders from the Soviet Union. So it's the Soviet Union's version of NATO. or Eastern European satellite nations, and that was when I was growing up, NATO versus the Warsaw Pact. Now, while we are focusing in on Europe, we kind of see things are happening throughout the world. In 1950, in June, advised by the Soviet Union and China, North Korea will invade South Korea. And you have a nice little graph on the side that kind of shows you how the war goes. You notice most of it's just stalemate. But in June of 1950, North Korea will invade South Korea with the backing of the Soviet Union and China. Like I said, Cold War. It's conflict between communism. Now, if you look at the map on the right, the Soviets, North Korea will attack in June. It'll push the South Koreans, the United States, all the way back to the Pusan perimeter. Now, what's interesting is in 1950, the Soviet Union was boycotting the United Nations because we did not recognize communist China. And so Harry Truman thought this is a perfect opportunity to, rather than having the United States step in alone and protect South Korea, let's go and get a resolution from the United Nations. And we got that. We actually got a UN resolution, because remember, the Soviets couldn't block it because they weren't there, that the United Nations is going to remove North Korean forces from South Korea. So General Douglas MacArthur is going to lead a successful counterattack in September of 1950, right where on that map it says Incheon. And it's so successful, we will actually almost get all the way up to China. And what happens is we go all the way up to the Yalu River, and the problem is North Korean forces that were remaining would go over into China, get resupplied, come back across the border and attack again. And so we came really close to bombarding China. And then in October of 1950, 300,000 Chinese forces will invade and push UN forces all the way back to the 38th parallel. And for really the last 3 years of the war, from late 1950 till 1953, it's really a stalemate along the 38th parallel. The North Koreans and the Chinese will go on an offensive. They'll be stopped. And in order to rebuild their armies, they'll come back to the negotiating table. And then when their armies are restocked, they'll attack again. Then when the United Nations, led by the United States, stops them again, they'll come back to the negotiating table. And so in 1953, we signed an armistice. So technically an armistice is not a ceasefire. So the war in Korea between North and South Korea is still going on today. So 38th parallel, Communist North, Democratic South. Even their recent leader in the last week, and this, of course, is April of 2020, their leader, Kim Jong-un, is reported to be on his deathbed after heart surgery. And besides the coronavirus issues, we're still looking at this because this is still a flashpoint. Life still goes on. We still got to worry about these things even in 2020. Now, Harry Truman wins and loses this. For one thing, containment worked. Remember, the containment policy is keep communism where it is. And he did that. The problem was that the peninsula is still half communism. If he was really strong on communism, he would have taken all of North Korea. Hell, some people argue if he's really strong on communism, he would have invaded China with nuclear bombs like General Douglas MacArthur wanted. He actually left office in 1952 as a very unpopular president. History has said over the years he's actually a very, very, very good president, ranks as one of the top presidents. But being called soft on communism because he didn't want to expand a nuclear war into China. Now, what we are dealing with now is a nuclear arms race. Remember that in 1945, the United States is the only nuclear nation that can counter the Soviets' large army. Then in August of 1949, we have weather balloons up in the atmosphere, and they're detecting all this radiation. They go, what the hell is going on? We found out that through a spy ring, the Soviet Union had detonated nuclear weapons, and that's where the nuclear arms race begins. And you can see by the graph on the side how many nuclear weapons each country is developing. By the 1960s, the United States has over 30,000 nuclear arms, and then when we slowly decline, because we get higher and higher yields, you don't need that many. By the mid-1980s, the Soviets have over 40,000 nuclear weapons, but they're going bankrupt to do this. And then eventually it would decline. In October 52, the UK gets nuclear weapons. February of 1960, France gets nuclear weapons. And then, of course, China has nuclear weapons today. So does Israel, um, Pakistan, India, North Korea claims it does. I think they have low yield nuclear weapons. Of course, information coming out of North Korea is so hit or miss. Now, because of all of this, and of course the expansion of possible communism into Europe, and then especially by 1949, the Soviet Union detonates a nuclear weapon, has found out that they got the information through a spy ring. There is a second Red Scare. And so the government, the United States government, is going to put in some things in place to make sure that communism doesn't take over our government. So we start with loyalty review boards. They're going to, for instance, you're going to interview for a government job, you got to go in front of a loyalty review board. Or if you do have a government job, they're going to call you in front of there. A lot of government officials, or people, not government officials themselves, a lot of people in the 1930s, they went to a communist meeting or two because remember the Great Depression. And there was a small movement that maybe communism is the answer. And what most Americans found out is it's not the answer. But just going to one or two communist meeting in the 1930s could wreak havoc on your life a decade later. So you even had the McCarran Internal Security Act of 1950, which says it's not illegal to be a part of the Communist Party, but all communist parties must register with the United States. And really, the United States is going to wants to know the members who are actively participating in the American Communist Party, which obviously you would say, well, that's an issue of your individual rights, but at that time we were so scared, we're like, too bad. Things got so bad that the House of Representatives created the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, in which they investigated Americans in front of a House review board, in which they called up a lot of different people and said, hey, you have pro-communist beliefs? They called in a lot of movie directors, a lot of actresses and actors, and some people refused to talk. Some people gave up names. Some people who refused to talk were blacklisted in Hollywood. That's what really became interesting was, this idea of Hollywood and the blacklisting of directors and things like that. Some people gave names, some people didn't. Looking back on it, it was at the time seemed like a good thing to do. Now looking back on it, it was a violation of rights. Now to really play this out was Senator Joseph McCarthy. He wasn't going to win re-election in 1952. So in order to get his name out there, he would create the McCarthy hearings. And the McCarthy hearings was a Senate committee to root out communism in the United States government. And it was a really powerful committee. And if you worked for the United States government, you were terrified that you were going to be called in front of this committee because Senator Joseph McCarthy would just berate you and yell at you and just say, you're a communist, admit it, resign your job. And these people were just losing their jobs. And a lot of this was on TV because there really wasn't a lot of must-see TV back then. And so during the day, you would see the McCarthy hearings. What happens over time is that McCarthy would call more and more people, but he would never present evidence. It was just a lot of berating people saying, you're communist, you know it. And of course, some people would say, obviously, well, show me the evidence. Well, I don't need to provide evidence, just admit it. And so other senators actually got the guts and stood up to him and said, present the evidence. And a lot of it he didn't have. So he would resign from office. That develops a new term in United States history called McCarthyism, which is making accusations without actual proof. If, like, I just don't like one of you guys, and I go, hey, I'm giving you a 0 on the test because you cheated. And obviously, you know you didn't cheat. So being an intelligent person you're going to say, well, please provide the evidence. And I go, I don't have to provide the evidence. You know you did it. Just admit you did it. I'll give you the 0. You go, provide the evidence. You don't know. I'm not going to. Well, that's sometimes called neo-McCarthyism. It's just, I didn't provide the evidence. I give you a 0 on the test. So that's what happened there. And of course, espionage. There was a big sensationalized case in the late 1940s of Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss had been an American diplomatic official, had been instrumental in setting up the United Nations. Then in 1949, there was a trial because it was believed that Alger Hiss was passing on information from the United Nations and other American government sources to the Soviets because some Soviet handlers had been caught in New York City and they were kind of just following the lines and said, okay, who were they involved with? The information was kind of scant. And Alger Hiss, he went on trial, said he had never met with any of these Soviet officials and never passed them information. The United States could prove that he did meet with these different Soviet handlers. We just couldn't prove that he actually passed them information. The best we could do was get Alger Hiss 5 years for perjury. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it was proved that he was passing on sensitive and top secret information to the Soviet Union. The one event that really scared a lot of people was the arrest and trial of should be Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They were a family in New York City, of all places, that were caught in the Soviet spy ring because after World War II, a lot of our best government scientists said the Soviets don't have the capabilities to develop a nuclear bomb until at least the late 1950s. Then in 1949, they detonated a nuclear bomb. It was found out that there were spies in Los Alamos laboratory in New Mexico that fed information to the Soviets. And along this spy ring, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, they had given the information to Soviet handlers in New York City. And since the one way you survive as a spy getting caught in the United States is, because technically you're supposed to be put to death, is you tell them what information you've gave away and who you gave the information to. Well, by the time it got to the Rosenbergs, there was no one left to rat out. They were put on trial and they would be executed. And in the last 10 years, their two sons had investigated it, trying to, clear their parents. Early on into their son's investigation, they said their father, Julius Rosenberg, yeah, he was really, really involved. Now they're trying to get their mother cleared. Although she did type up some of the information, they said, well, she's not as guilty, I guess. That really scares a lot of people. Now, Dwight Eisenhower, the former World War II general, gets elected in 1953, and he is going to create brinkmanship. Now, his Secretary of State is John Foster Dulles, and he is going to create massive retaliation. Look, let's be honest. Even today, there's really no way to stop a country from launching nuclear weapons at us and shooting down the missiles. Even back then, we knew that. We knew that if the Soviet Union was going to launch missiles at us, there's nothing we can do to stop it. Well, under massive retaliation, it's a very simple response to if the Soviets launch missiles at us. We just tell them we're going to launch missiles at you. Mutually assured destruction. We're all going to die. This goes back to the rationale that the Soviets saying all this crazy stuff up at the top of government, they're rational. They're not going to go to nuclear war. So really it is, hey, Soviets, you're going to launch missiles at us? We'll just launch them back at you. And that's fine. Massive retaliation. And it actually works. You're going to punch me? I'll punch you back. Rather than just promoting the idea of containment, you got to put a little fear into Americans because containment just says keep communism where it is. Now we promote the idea of the domino theory. And the domino theory is going to get the United States active in Asia, especially since China fell to communism in 1949. The Korean Peninsula almost fell to communism in 1953. The domino theory really simply states that if one country falls to communism, the rest of the countries in the area are going to fall to communism. Eventually, it's going to be the United States. As you can see by that little cartoon at the bottom, China, Korea, Vietnam, then Laos, Cambodia, and then so on and so on and so on. You want to stop that. You want to stop it in Korea. You want to stop it in Vietnam so it doesn't end up in the United States. On top of that, Dwight Eisenhower is going to create the Eisenhower Doctrine. It's very similar to the Truman Doctrine, but we are going to invest hundreds of millions of dollars to stabilize the Middle East because there were excursions by communism in the Middle East. Because believe it or not, the Soviet Union is just north of Iran. They're right there. They're sending in undercover folks to cause instability in the Middle East. Well, Eisenhower wants to stop that. Main reason, obviously, is you don't want communism to spread, but also Middle East, oil. Now, what's interesting is in 1953, the United States creates this idea of atoms for peace. We want to lessen tension with the Soviet Union. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have like a campaign throughout the world talking about the benefits of nuclear power because everyone is talking about nuclear weapons and destruction, but we want to go around and create the benefits of nuclear power plants and what this energy can do for weaker nations and poorer nations. And this becomes somewhat of a thaw. Why is 1953 also a thaw with the Soviet Union? Because Joseph Stalin dies. And there's a lot of de-Stalinization, and the new leaders, even in the 1950s, the Soviets realized we got to do a little bit more to help the Soviet citizens. And so there is somewhat of a thaw, but things will kind of develop again because in 1957, the Soviets will launch Sputnik into space and will enter the space race. And obviously, the response is, well, if the Soviets can launch something into space, there must be a missile gap. They must have much better missiles than we do. We're falling behind them. So we got to ramp up our space race and our missile race. And then what almost causes a real big international incident is in 1960, a U-2 spy plane flown by Francis Gary Powers is shot down over the Soviet Union. And obviously, we're saying, well, no, we're not actually flying planes over the Soviet Union. The truth it is, we are. It gets shot down. It is a big blunder for the United States. The Soviet Union's upset, and Powers goes to jail for a year, and eventually he'll be traded for a Soviet spy. But it's just a black guy in the United States. But by the early 1960s, late 1960s, with more and more satellites going up into space, we'll get better and better with cameras in the space. But still, through the 1980s, we flew missions over the Soviet Union. Now, Vietnam and Cuba, Eisenhower. Now, these are two other flashpoints, like I said, that is going to compete communism versus capitalism. So in Vietnam, you had the Geneva Convention, or conference, sorry. In 1954, France, who had taken back Vietnam after World War II, had lost. They had lost at Dien Bien Phu, a battle up in North Vietnam, to the communists, and they withdrew. In order to make sure that there's some stability in Vietnam, the Geneva Conference is going to split Vietnam along the 17th parallel. Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese controlled north of the 17th parallel, backed by China and the Soviet Union. They are communist. And then South Vietnam is controlled by the United States, or at least influenced, in order to protect other Asian nations from this spreading communism, because you see North Vietnam and China. United States backed the creation of Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SEATO, which is a defensive alliance, just like NATO. This one happens to be with the Southeast Asian countries. Doesn't really prove to be that successful, but it is an attempt. What we are trying to do here is just like what worked in Korea, or just like what worked in Europe. We're trying to do it here in Vietnam, which would prove to be a failure. One major reason is the South Vietnamese governments are just really, really bad. Then in Cuba, in 1959, Fidel Castro, who had led a Cuban revolution since the 1950s, was successful. He would depose the dictator, Batista, and Batista was very friendly with the United States, very friendly with American businesses, but the average Cuban people were really quite poor. And so the words of Fidel Castro would resonate with the Cuban people. We know he's communist, but he doesn't openly promote his communism, but he simply says, I'm for Cuba. And so we don't like him, especially since Cuba's 90 miles off the coast of Florida. So we establish an American embargo. We're going to cut off Cuba from all American goods and travel. And that embargo still exists today. It was relaxed under the Obama administration. So I think for about a year, you could fly to Cuba. And then under the Donald Trump administration, it was put back up again. It's just different views of how to deal with communism. And of course, eventually, and we'll talk about that in a moment, Cuba will have an alliance with the Soviet Union. There'll be reasons for that. Now, in 1961, the Soviet Union is really having a problem, and it happens to be with Berlin. Remember, it's a competition. Capitalism in the United States versus communism in the Soviet Union. And it's always who's better. The United States has nuclear weapons, we're better. The Soviet Union got Sputnik into space, they're better. Well, but 1961, through the United States and the Marshall Plan, West Berlin is modern. It is really economically successful. East Berlin is still like what it was after World War II. And so what happens is, in 1961, tens of thousands of citizens from East Germany and East Berlin start simply walking over into West Berlin. And from West Berlin, they can take trains to West Germany. This is a black eye for the Soviet Union. If you're trying to promote the idea that communism is so great, then why are all your citizens that have been under your control since the end of World War II going into the half that is under control of capitalism? So in 1961, the Soviet Union is going to put up a wall to keep people in. And that wall will be around from 1961 to 1989. And in 1963, John F. Kennedy will be the first American president to go to the wall, to go to West Berlin and challenge the moral legitimacy of the Soviet Union, saying, if you're such a great nation and if communism is so great, why do you have to have a wall? If it's such a great way to live, you don't need a wall. People will be flocking into the Soviet Union, but they're not. He basically says in that nice little German there, I am a Berliner. I am backing you. You have nothing to worry about. We are not going to let you fall to Soviet communism. At the same time John F. Kennedy gets into office, he is dealing with the Cuban issue. Now, under the Dwight Eisenhower administration of 1959-1960, the United States secretly had been training Cuban exiles in Central America to invade Cuba, to take it back. And so when John F. Kennedy gets elected in 1961, he is told of this plan and he goes along with it. So in 1961, at the Bay of Pigs, which is along the southern coast of Cuba, Cuban exiles trained and supplied by the United States will have a beach invasion of Cuba. John F. Kennedy does change the battle plan with one thing. He says, I don't want American pilots flying bombing missions or fighter plane missions over Cuba. I don't want to do that. The Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961 was a complete failure. And that's going to be a teachable moment for John F. Kennedy because he listened to his advisors, listened to all these military officials and said, yeah, fine, we'll do it. Well, this is where Fidel Castro, who at the time wasn't openly pro-Soviet Union, this is when he says, I'm communist and the Soviets are backing me up. Because look, he gets elected, he takes power in 1959. He knows the United States doesn't want him there. So the United States backs the Bay of Pig invasion, which was a failure. His mindset that the next obvious action by the United States would be invasion. So starting in 1962, he is going to sign an alliance with the Soviet Union, and he will allow the Soviet Union to place missiles in his country for a protection, like massive retaliation. You're going to invade Cuba, I'll launch the missiles. October of 1962, a U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba sees these missile sites. And so now John F. Kennedy has a dilemma. What does he do? And so what John F. Kennedy is going to do is he could send his Air Force there and bomb the missile sites. He could have a traditional land invasion. Now, he was under the understanding that these missile sites were just under construction. The truth was, many years later, we found out they had missiles ready to be fired. But John F. Kennedy, learning from the Bay of Pigs issue, said, well, I'm going to go out on my own. I have a little more confidence. He is going to put a quarantine around Cuba. And he tells the Soviet Union, I am not going to allow any Soviet ships come and go until you guys remove your missiles from Cuba. And as this was happening, word gets out that there are Soviet freighters crossing the Atlantic with missiles on their deck. What happens when these Soviet freighters meet the American naval blockade and try to break this quarantine? And while this is happening, the United States is negotiating with the Soviets. So it's not just, no communication. Kennedy is talking with Khrushchev. And then when the Soviet ships get within sight of the American blockade, the Soviets blink. And the Soviets will turn their ships around and they'll agree to remove their missiles. Now, that's what the American public is told. The truth be told is the United States agreed to remove their missiles from Turkey. The United States also agreed not to invade Cuba. On the same time, the Soviets, after having listening to Fidel Castro during this time period, kind of didn't want the Cubans to have control of the missiles. And so that was the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's when people started building backyard bomb shelters. That's when you really started ramping up, Bert the Turtle, Duck and Cover. You can look that up on YouTube. It's called Bert the Turtle, Duck and Cover, which is a 9-minute video produced like in 1960 of how to successfully survive a nuclear bomb, if there's with warning, without warning, and things like that. Now, the space race. In 1958, the United States would create NASA, then the National Aeronautical and Space Administration. And this is a response to Sputnik in 1957. Early 1961, the Soviets would launch Yuri Gagarin into space. So we're always a step behind. And so John F. Kennedy, when he gets into office, he is going to spend a lot of government expenditures on science and the space race. And the goal or the end, winning trophy of the space race is to get a man on the moon. And so the United States would catch up very quickly and surpass and surpass the Soviet Union. We create the Mercury program, which was our earliest space program with a single person capsule. Alan Shepard is the first American in space in 1961. He literally they just strapped him into a Mercury capsule, which is really just a missile. They shot him right up into space. He came right back down. John Glenn in 1962 was the first American to orbit the Earth, more controlled flight. Then we had the Gemini program, which was a two-person capsule. That eventually we had the Apollo program, which was a three-person capsule with a command module and a lunar lander. And in July of 1969, Apollo 11 would land on the moon. The first man on the moon is Neil Armstrong, followed by Buzz Aldrin. And when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, he said that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. We beat the Soviets to the moon. How did the Soviet scientists react when they watched with the rest of the world when the United States landed on the moon? They all applauded. This was a great achievement. You know, you have these different countries fighting each other, but to the scientists, like, this is a really awesome thing we did. And by 1972, we stopped going to the moon because it was expensive, and also we kind of got a lot of information from it already. We're like, okay. Now, we're starting to get into Vietnam. John F. Kennedy had under the 1950s, Dwight Eisenhower, since 1954, had sent in money to help the South Vietnamese economy, just like the Marshall Plan put in money to rebuild Europe. When that really wasn't working due to the corruption of the South Vietnamese government, John F. Kennedy, when he gets elected, he's going to keep sending money in, but he's going to start escalating the American involvement by sending in military advisors to train the South Vietnamese army. Well, this still isn't working. And so in 1964, in August, in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is just is the eastern water area of North Vietnam, a United States ship called the USS Maddox was off the coast in international waters, listening to North Vietnamese radio traffic when it was attacked. The USS Maddox was apparently attacked by several North Vietnamese torpedo ships. And because that attack happened in international waters, Lyndon Johnson is going to go to Congress, and Congress is going to pass a resolution that allows for combat troops in Vietnam. It's not actually a declaration of war. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution just simply says the United States can send troops into Vietnam to protect our interest. And this is really going to scale up because almost immediately we create Operation Rolling Thunder, in which we are going to bombard North Vietnam. We will actually drop more bombs in North Vietnam than we did in all of World War II. At the same time, we are going to increase our soldiers from 1964, which was about 50,000 soldiers, to 1969, when there was 540,000 combat troops in Vietnam. To give you an idea, under the last Iraqi war, I think at the most we had 135,000 soldiers in Iraq, 540,000 soldiers. Now, from 1966, 67, early 1968, the United States is winning many, many military battles, but they're small battles. And then late 1967, early 1968, the North Vietnamese army is pretty much inactive. The United States military is saying, well, due to casualties and everything like that, we've destroyed the North Vietnamese army. And we've destroyed their South Vietnamese allies, and they're called the Viet Cong. And they're telling this to the news media. And the news media is reporting to the American people that the war is over, the war is over, the war is over. It's just a matter of time now. Then in February of 1968, January and February of 1968, you have the Tet Offensive. Now, traditionally in Vietnam, the Tet is the new year, and both sides stand down. South Vietnamese soldiers go home, North Vietnamese soldiers go home, and then they start the war up again. Now, what the North Vietnamese have been doing is they had stopped fighting for several months to create an offensive. They were getting their troops prepared. They were supplying their troops. They were supplying the South Vietnamese communists called the Viet Cong. And then in January of 1968, while the American public is being told that this war is over, all hell breaks loose. And the Viet Cong, the South Vietnamese, launched surprise attacks all throughout South Vietnam. Our embassy in Saigon, which is the capital of South Vietnam, is under the control, for the lower floors are under the control of the Viet Cong, and there's footage of our American ambassador pointing down to the Marines, going, "They're down there, they're down there." And then you had all this footage because this is the time of TV where you could get footage from the war within 24 hours, especially with satellites. And before the Tet Offensive, you're being told this war is successful for the United States. After the Tet Offensive, you're being told that hey, this thing ain't gonna be over. And so it's just total chaos. It is a huge military victory for the United States. We essentially destroy the North Vietnamese army, destroy the South Vietnamese Viet Cong, but it's a political loss. Walter Cronkite, the very respected nightly news broadcaster, actually goes on TV and goes, "I don't think this thing can be won." And people listen to him. He's the voice of middle America, the average American. If he's telling us war can't be won, you can't trust the military. And so that really hurts Lyndon Johnson. After the Tet Offensive, Lyndon Johnson, who could run for your election, he goes on TV and goes, "I will not seek nor will I accept the nomination to run for election." This war really weighed on him. When we go into the social aspects of Lyndon Johnson's presidency, very successful. But foreign policy, Vietnam ate him up. And so these are some very, very poignant pictures. The picture on the upper right is a Pulitzer Prize winning picture. And those kids are crying, and the girl is naked because her clothes have been burned off. The United States had napalmed her village, and she is on fire. Napalm is a gel that gets on you. So her clothes are burned off. She's crying because she's burning. The picture on the right is a South Vietnamese officer shooting a Viet Cong, I guess, soldier in the head during the Tet Offensive. And that is actually camera footage that was shown in the United States, and it's really gruesome. Now, it's very interesting, and I know it's weird how I fit into this, but when I was growing up in Fairfax, there was a mall down the street from my high school called Rolling Valley Mall, and there was this pizza place in there. And I just remember going there with my older sister because the pizza was cheap, and there's a movie theater next to it. And there was this old Vietnamese couple that just argued over and over and over. And I was like, "Kim, they complain all the time, don't they?" She's like, "Yeah, they do." Well, what's actually interesting is that couple, the gentleman who was like then in his like 60s, he is the guy actually shooting the gun right there. He had actually survived the war, made it to America. Then it got out in the early 1990s that he was the gentleman that is known for this picture right here, and he basically had to close his business. So yeah, he actually opened up a pizza place in Northern Virginia. Now, Richard Nixon gets elected. Richard Nixon has some successes, but oh, Watergate, Watergate, Watergate. His Secretary of State is Henry Kissinger. And they're going to create something called détente. When you see détente, that means lessening of tensions. Obviously, lessening of tensions in Vietnam and with the Soviet Union. So he creates something called the Nixon Doctrine, which is going to try to compete with communism wherever it is in the world, and also kind of get under the Soviet Union. And so the one way he is going to win election is on Vietnamization. Vietnamization is withdrawing American soldiers from Vietnam and letting the South Vietnamese fight the war. If the South Vietnamese really want to be free, let them fight the war. No longer are American boys going to be killed over in Vietnam. 1969, you have 540,000 American soldiers. By the early 1970s, you're down to less than 100,000. At the same time, in 1949, China goes red. It goes communist. And what's interesting is the Soviet Union and China are actually rivals. They really don't get along that well. You have the Soviet Union saying, "We are the original communist country, thus everyone should follow us." While China is saying, "Well, look at where the communist revolutions are occurring. They are occurring in underdeveloped nations in Asia and other parts of the world that really would follow our blueprint." And so in 1972, in order to kind of nudge the Soviets to the table to negotiate nuclear weapons, Richard Nixon is going to meet the Chinese for the first time ever. He's going to meet with Chairman Mao. He's going to recognize Communist China. Eventually, that seat in the Security Council will be switched from Taiwan to China. And that is simply to get the Soviets to go, "Well, since there's so much tension between us and the United States, now the United States is going to deal with China. If we don't watch it, we're going to be out on our own." And so that brings the Soviets to the table. And the Soviets actually invite Richard Nixon to visit them. Their leader is Leonid Brezhnev. And so in 1972, Richard Nixon goes to Moscow and he'll sign the first of many arms limitation treaties. And so SALT 1, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties, discusses how many nuclear warheads you can have, how many delivery devices you can have, how they can be delivered, whether it is missile silos, submarines, mobile missile launching devices. And so that does lessen some tensions. Now, Vietnamization, like I mentioned, he gets elected on this. He wants to get the American soldiers out. So, the purpose of Vietnamization is to expand, equip, and train the South Vietnamese, reduce American troop involvement, and to negotiate peace with honor, which means have a peace agreement with the North Vietnamese, but not give up in a sense of, here, just take South Vietnam. And what he did in secret, which is going to hurt him, in a lot of ways that the North Vietnamese were getting supplies down to the South, was they were going through Cambodia and Laos. And so what Nixon is going to order in secret is the bombardment of Cambodia to stop the movement of supplies on the Ho Chi Minh Trail from the north to the south. That is technically illegal. It's against the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. It's the escalation of the war. He can't do that. And what happens in 1971, a military advisor for the United States is going to pass on thousands of pages of documents to the New York Times. And the New York Times is going to publish what becomes known as the Pentagon Papers. And it's going to outline America's involvement in Asia when it comes to communism. It's also really going to focus on the United States' involvement in Vietnam. And it's going to highlight the expansion of the war and these secret bombings in Cambodia. So really the Pentagon Papers were to avoid defeat, to ensure containment, not to help South Vietnam. But it also talked about the expansion of the war. The United States government is actually going to sue the New York Times, also at the same time sue the Washington Post, because the Washington Post also published the Pentagon Papers. And in a 6-3 ruling, the United States Supreme Court is going to rule in favor of the New York Times and the Washington Post, regardless how they got the information. The essence of a true democracy is freedom of the press. And so the Pentagon Papers does start that first black eye on Richard Nixon's presidency, which would be ended by the Watergate scandal. But also, Congress, 10 years after the start of Vietnam, they start looking at the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution and realize only war can be declared by Congress. And we never declared war in Vietnam. We have a Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, but it's not a declaration of war. And so in order to rein in presidential power, they're going to pass the War Powers Act of 1973, which still involved, is still around today, which says if the United States president is going to send troops somewhere in the world that could be actively engaged in battle, they have to inform Congress 48 hours in advance. Now, that can be done in private. They're not going to announce it to the world, but they have to tell them, hey, this is what we're going to do. Because sometimes you can't wait on a goal. You can't wait on the UN. You can't wait on a declaration of war because the situation is so dire. But the War Powers Act does say within 60 days, you got to get military authorization, which means you need a declaration of war. You just can't send troops in like the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution and be there 9 years later. So in the War Powers Act, you got to give Congress 48 hours advance notice. After 60 days, the president has to come back to Congress and say, I want a declaration of war. If he does not get a declaration of war or seek a declaration of war, then after 60 days, all soldiers must be withdrawn within 30 days. And then finally, in 1973, we signed the Paris Peace Accords, which withdraws American soldiers for the most part. All we have left is our embassy and a couple thousand soldiers down to South Vietnam and Saigon. But when North Vietnam invades again in 1975, the United States does nothing from stopping them from invading South Vietnam. Now, under Gerald Ford, his lessening of tensions. Well, what is he dealing with? Well, first thing he tries to do is he does have one success. He does sign the Helsinki Accords with the Soviet Union. Now, believe it or not, this was signed in 1975. For 30 years, from 1945 until 1975, there's still a lot of tension in Europe. The Soviets, we believe, still want to acquire more land and more influence in Europe. The Helsinki Accords of 1975 simply says the status quo of Europe is the status quo of Europe. Whatever lies under the Soviet sphere of influence, Eastern Europe is it. The Soviets are no longer going to try to expand communism in Europe, nor are the capitalist nations going to try to openly try to get Eastern European countries to rebel or anything like that, just to kind of keep the peace. Whatever it was, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, that's been like since the 1940s, that is the status quo. We are not going to try to infiltrate each side anymore, at least in public. Yes, the CIA is still going to go into Eastern Europe. The KGB is still going to go into Western Europe. He does sign another strategic arms limitation treaty with the Soviet Union, and then he is also involved with the fall of Vietnam. In 1975, after 2 years of relative peace, North Vietnam is going to invade South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese are going to look towards the United States, and the United States says, we signed the Paris Peace Accords. We're not going to get involved. And as the North Vietnamese army goes to Saigon, thousands and thousands of South Vietnamese in Saigon who had helped the United States over the years, they flooded the American embassy. And that picture right there is the last picture of the United States leaving their embassy in South Vietnam. And those are South Vietnamese trying to get on that helicopter. They don't know it's the last helicopter leaving. The last helicopter involved had a couple Marines and our ambassador. And so from 1975 to 1995, we really had no diplomatic relations openly with Vietnam until Bill Clinton got elected. But Vietnam would fall to communism. Last thing today, I know it's a lot of stuff. Jimmy Carter, he gets elected. In 1977, he will sign the Panama Canal Treaty, which hands over the Panama Canal, which had been under the control of the United States since 1903, for the most part, although we did pay rent for it. He gave control of the Panama Canal back over to Panama. His big diplomatic success with the Camp David Accords. Camp David is a military installation outside Washington, D.C. and Maryland, and a lot of times on the weekends, that's where presidents go. And in 1978, he will negotiate a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. That is because since the 1940s and 50s, the surrounding nations of Israel have been constantly attacking Israel. And there's a lot of, you can take a whole class of Middle East tension with Israel and the surrounding nations. But by 1978, you can see that picture with Jimmy Carter. The gentleman on the left, Anwar Sadat, he is the premier of Egypt. He was sick and tired of all the fighting. And so he is going to meet with Israel. And he will be the first country to openly recognize Israel as a nation. And he says, we're no longer going to attack you. We're done with that. It's going to cost him his life. He will be assassinated for that. But he was willing to see that all this fighting is not worth it. So Camp David Accords is very successful. Jimmy Carter will also sign SALT II, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty Part 2. But there are some problems during Jimmy Carter's administration. When we go into domestic policy, we'll talk about the gas shortage or Jimmy Carter coming on TV and saying, gas prices are high. You may want to wear a sweater in your house. We're like, oh, this guy's exciting. He's still alive today, a great humanitarian, still in his 90s, building homes for Habitat for Humanity. Very respected gentleman. Now, in 1979, the Soviet Union will invade Afghanistan. They want to spread communism into Afghanistan. And like I said, the United States backs countries against Soviet aggression. So from 1979 until 1988, the United States will openly back the Mujahideen, which are the freedom fighters. Afghanistan will become the Vietnam for the Soviet Union, slowly just undermine the Soviet Union when it comes to the military, it comes to money and stuff like that. Because of this invasion, the United States would boycott the Moscow Olympics in 1980. That would be the Summer Olympics. The Winter Olympics had already occurred, and that's where the United States Olympic hockey team beat the Soviets. Now, what really defined Jimmy Carter's administration was another failure, and that in 1979, Iran had an Islamic revolution led by the Ayatollah Khomeini. And when this happens, you have young Iranians who will overtake the American embassy. 55 American hostages are held for 444 days in prison. And we get information in 1980 towards the end of Jimmy Carter's presidency that we know where they're located. So Jimmy Carter is going to initiate Operation Eagle Claw, in which um, several military helicopters are going to fly across the desert, and they were going to land and rescue these people. But as they were flying across the desert to get in, and they were into Iran, one of the helicopters crashed. And when the helicopters crashed, we turned back. And so that kind of said, okay, that kind of highlighted the end of Jimmy Carter's administration. And that's something Reagan's going to have to deal with when he gets elected. And one of the first things he does when he gets elected is he will get the hostages released from Iran. I know that is a lot of stuff, but that is to supplement your reading in the American Yop. Hopefully, this will also help you if you have a prompt on the Cold War, especially Cold War in Europe, the Cold War in Asia.